I'm Samantha, Julian, Tanya, and Tara, and three of us are from Tender Claws, Tara's from Piehole, and we're going to be talking about integrating live actors into a non-location-based experience. So how many of you know a little bit about Tender Claws or have heard about us? Cool, awesome. So our studio kind of works across a range of different disciplines and media. Our two most recent projects are the AR app Tendar and VR for virtual reality, but we've also worked across mobile apps, installation, visual arts, and even sports with tumbleweed and leaf blowers. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today in terms of the XR community is there's a lot of legitimate and well-founded buzz about the parallels, crossovers, and intersections between theater, live performance, and immersive digital media. The term virtual reality actually comes from about the 1920s and 1930s when Artaud was writing this book about some of his essays and his experience with theater called Theater and Stubble, and I've highlighted the term virtual reality. So you can see this is, of course, translated from French, which the meaning is slightly different there. So when people talk about including live actors, it's often considering a really promising and interesting space, but is often kind of dismissed as being a little bit difficult for obvious reasons, for possibly production or scale. But it's such a fruitful and interesting territory that we think it's worth pushing it and pushing on the constraints and finding unique ways and opportunities to give home access to live performers. So when we were creating this project, these are some of the design considerations that we were originally wrestling with. And as artists who have history working with theater and VR, and who have spent the last year in the trenches working on this kind of non-location-based at-home experience, we wanted to give this talk to spark further discussion about how performers could be integrated outside location-based entertainment, or LBE. So here are some of the things that we're trying as a jumping-off point for bringing live actors into the home. And these are the structure of some of the things we're going to talk about today and who's going to be talking about them. So to start, I'm going to show a little bit of teaser of The Under Presents.
Distinguished guests, are you looking for a little entertainment? You've come to the right place. A venue outside of time and space. May I present The Under.
Sweet. So for some context on The Under Presents, there's actually these two intersecting worlds. So the game begins in the Under, which is this kind of vaudeville stage that exists outside time and space. It's inhabited by these quirky lost voyages and souls that wander off course and became lost in time, and then they all kind of perform for you under the guise of this mysterious MC, or the proprietor of the stage. But it's important to say that there's actually a story within a story. So even though we'll be talking mostly about the Under and some of the live elements that are there, there's actually a long-form content of another narrative that takes place on a ship, which is the last few months of an ill-fated trip from a research vessel where players witness a survival narrative that unfolds between characters while discovering that they may or may not have the power to influence the crew's fate and change how time operates on the ship. Tara's going to quickly, briefly run you through some of the context of the ways we're using live actors so we can talk about this.
Yes, so two of the main ways that we are talking about that we're using live actors in the experience. One is doing these live stage acts as hosts, and so we create these different types of acts like a jazzercise routine or a game show, and that takes place on the stage of the Under, which is highlighted on the left side, and different characters can slot into those roles. So you can have different characters who do the game show host depending on which actor is plugging into that act. And over on the right, This is an example of a one-on-one live encounter, and those can happen in multiple locations, but they tend to take place in more intimate spaces and create a more intimate experience for the player. So the actors, and this would inhabit these different avatars, and those are highlighted up there. And they interact with the players who have a more anonymous look to them, to their design. And beyond those two specific live actor roles, we also have the actors inhabiting NPC characters that you see in the more narrative, the survival narrative part of the experience that Samantha was just talking about. So in other words, you would see pre-recorded scenes with those characters, but we also have live actors at key moments possessing those NPC characters, NPCs, and having these live moments with them. And so beyond those three roles, we work with actors to develop characterization, voice, and story and structure of these moments and develop movement with them. So each actor is able to actually have their own characters that kind of go with play to their strengths and abilities, and then they kind of tailor each pre-structured experience or encounter to their own thing, their own vibe. So yeah.
So as the lead designer, narrative designer rather, I'm going to be talking about scripting and how do you create scripts for kind of more improv live characters and acts. The scripts have to simultaneously be structured, but also modular and variable so that they can feel responsive. And some of the inspirations for the project that led to our thoughts on scripting are these three medias. Anybody recognize any of them besides Journey? Yeah. Cool. So we take a lot of our inspiration from not just games, but from different media as well. So this book called The Invention of Morale is largely about a time loop that features echoes of the past. It's ambiguous to the reader if the characters inside it are kind of living or recording, but it's key that because the narrator believes they are alive, it transforms the narrator from a spectator into a participant. And that ambiguity heightens the mystery and the desire to explore the island for this narrator. And Sleep No More, which is a pretty well-known, immersive theater piece, it also operates on a loop. If a guest is really persistent with a character, they may be rewarded by the character breaking their loop to engage in the guest with an intimate one-on-one encounter. This act of signaling out the guest creates a heightened moment where the player is seen. And the process of being seen is really important to enhance the feel of liveness. And then finally, in terms of multiplayer interaction, a game that I think was really seminal for a lot of us, especially as a Tender Clause's Journey, we're thinking about, how when we first played Journey, there was a very formative moment when we realized that what we thought was our AI guide was actually another living person, that we were able to recognize that through their motions and intent. So at that moment was something super powerful that I'm going to kind of get to later. We also decided to, in terms of the multiplayer experience, limit some of the ways that players can communicate with each other purposely in order to encourage emergent forms of play and new ways of communication and gesture between players. So what all of the references have in common is this idea of a pivot point between liveness and non-liveness, and how they come into contact to generate a space where there's an extraordinary awareness of the other. It's sort of an uncanny space. And I realized that, the uncanny valley, there's connotations within that, and it shares some of the features of what I'm talking about, but instead of eliciting a cold, eerie feeling of coming against another kind of humanoid creature, I'm choosing to use the uncanny as a term to describe the space of discomfort and wonder that derives from comforting the ontology of another being as simultaneously human and non-human, and the power that mystery generates in that moment to hold our attention and to bring in players into focusing on specific areas of the game. So the main impact of the Uncanny is a way to focus and draw attention to key story moments. It also adds magic and anticipation to pre-recorded content that is much less resource intensive because there's a sense that anything could happen at any time, and in many ways in the structure of our game it can and does. But this can be, more or less true in certain areas of the Under especially. There's something that I'd like to show which kind of, for me, exemplifies the moment when a outside player or user is brushing up against this definition of like movement that is both living and non-living simultaneously, and how that kind of instates wonder and attraction. And this is this beautiful scored unintentional performance piece. So at the living mannequin, the purpose of that is to kind of bring this liveness into the space to attract passerbys and have them wander into the world of the store, into the world of the setup, or refocus attention to specific objects. And in terms of, I think, punctuating a lot of what we're going to be doing in the game with these moments that are one-on-one, I'm thinking that some of them can start in a way that there's a kind of discrepancy and mystery. Is this, other person, is this other character, this other, NPC or performer living or non? And in order to actually write for that, there's ways to work around the technical and design narrative constraints, the resources that you need to keep character consistency and maintain character voice without needing the same actor on staff 24/7. So basically what I'm saying is that there are certain NPCs, and this is one particular moment of how we use live actors, this isn't like all of the different ways, where they can be inhabited and possessed by a live actor. And it's not immediately clear to the player that that is what's happening. However, the constraint is because we have the character and we have the voice actor. This is an established character. People know the voice of this character. So how do you create dialogue that any actor can join in and use the voice of the character to interact with the player? And a lot of like the kind of, I think, nuance about writing this dialogue in this way is really interesting. So one way that we could approach this and that we're working on is this idea of soundboards. What we'll get into later is it's very much how our actors engage with the audience is very much like puppetry. So there's certain like interfaces they can manipulate and work with that, we're trying to make, more like kind of natural and seamless. And one of these interfaces is a way of triggering sound clips. But I think it's not just like any writing for sound clips will work. It has to be a combination between how the actor knows to trigger the sound clips at the right time and what feels right for their performance, and writing that feels it's seamless and interruptible. So in order to kind of script narrative encounters, one of the ways I'm thinking about this is creating narrative backbone. There's a guiding principle. There needs to be enough anchoring, like points within the encounter to give context to why the player is there, why the actor is, what their minimum roles are, so that there can actually be room left for the player to enter these roles and enter into play with the actor. One of the things we're thinking about is how to focus these encounters on a meditative activity or an activity that can be shared, because that also opens up a room for play and ways that the player can be responsive to the actor and the actor can know how to trigger certain bins or certain areas to feel like very responsive and one-on-one sound clips depending on what the player is doing. And as players are engaging with the actor, it's kind of like they're performing along with the actor. They're really filling in the blanks of what is happening. And depending on how the player's engaging with them, actors can kind of decide how much dialogue they want to trigger, whether they want to do a lot of the interaction through gestures, whether there's certain points they want to like trigger exact elements of the story to punctuate what is happening. And it's up to I worked with Ben Vegas and Piehole to develop a lot of these storyboards, and it's up to us as writers to kind of create basically text and framework for the actor to use as improv tools from their toolbox to kind of grab from, right? So I can kind of give a very specific example. This is like an early draft of one particular NPC. And the context is that there's on an island skipping stones, and it's a very like short meditative action, but there's a narrative backbone, which is mostly on the left, that is digestible, small, breakable chunks that can be triggered maybe in sequence, but it doesn't have to all be triggered. And it can also be triggered at the actor's decision. It's important when thinking about writing this sort of way that like each of these kind of have to stand on their own because you don't know how much time is going to be passed between the next element that's triggered. So they have to be complete thoughts, and they have to all kind of relate to the tone and the atmosphere that the actor is trying to convey. So on the right, there's also a way to, and these are just small samples, really you need, I think, a larger set, but a way to create bins where the actor knows that, okay, if this person throws a rock, the rock mechanic is really like elaborate, so it's actually really like skipping stones, and it's not the best throw. Maybe they want to create a one-on-one, a one-to-one response to that, and they know that there's a bin that they can trigger to do so, and that the tone of that bin will be short responses that non-repeatable that can feel kind of a little bit of natural in the moment, and how you actually have to write for that is really complicated because you have to vary sentence length, you have to like make sure that the actor knows that it's not just going to be once a statement and once a question, and they won't know how to like respond to that in the moment. They know there has to be a uniformity to like the particular bins they're triggering. Okay. And finally, on the left, because the stone throwing is rather realistic, we want to create a sort of invite the physicality of the actor and the player into the scene. And if the actor decides it's relevant, they can actually train and teach the player to kind of throw the stone in ways that they might engage or give tips that feel responsive to the action that the player is doing at that moment. And then one of the things I think on the right you can see that's writing for these spaces of how and I know Tara's going to talk about this, but ways that the players may respond to the actors. It's a little bit of kind of fortune telling, both trial and error and fortune telling, where you think, okay, what are the range of like player possibilities and ways that they can engage with the actor? What are things they might do? And then you have to have like a backup plan for like the actor to, if someone teleports away, what do they say? What are some of the ways they can engage with that? And we're open, we want the player to be able to leave and feel that's correct, so we're not trying to bring them back. But we still have to think about how the actor responds to exact different ways players can behave. And of course it's live, so there's so many things we can't account for, and that's part of the magic. So now Julian is going to talk about interfaces and infrastructure.
Hi, everyone. When you're integrating live performers into an immersive VR experience, you have to decide what you're optimizing for. For the underpresents, we want to create intimate moments between players and actors, and we want to maximize the number of meaningful interactions where a player feels truly special. We don't think that we could accomplish this by having a single shared space with hundreds of players. It just wouldn't facilitate those kinds of interactions. Instead, we're aiming to have lots of shared spaces that each have 10 to 20 players. And that leads us to these questions. How do players and live performers join these shared spaces? And when they join a space, which space do they end up in? How do multiplayer interactions work within these spaces? And what tools do the live performers have to facilitate unique, magical moments for the players? Hi, I'm Julian, and as a systems developer at TenderClaws, it's been one of my roles to try to come up with good solutions and implementations for these questions. First, How do players and live performers join shared networked spaces? Remember, here's the player on the left, and for them, the answer is really simple. Similar to Journey, we want to give them a very seamless experience where they don't need to think about how the networking works. They just enter the space. Behind the scenes, their client makes a request to our backend servers, and that causes the backend servers to verify the player's identity, retrieve the information about past encounters that that player has had. And then we retrieve information from our database that provides information about what shared space they should end up in. And then we send that information back to the player client, which can then join that space. The situation is a little bit more complicated for actors, because we want to give them agency in deciding where they could have the most impact. But we also don't want to overwhelm them with options, and so we created this simple interface that lets them choose to enter a shared space or room with players who meet certain criteria, like never having seen a live actor before, or never having seen a specific type of stage act. Actors can also jump into a space to help out another actor, or they can enter a random space if they're feeling lucky and they want to try improving for players without really knowing much about what they're getting into. The situation behind the scenes is actually pretty similar to the flow for players. The actor's device asks our backend servers, hey, what room choices do I have? The servers then verify the actor's identity, and they actually make sure that they're authorized to wield actor powers. We don't really want hackers or regular players to have access to all of an actor's special, almost godlike abilities. And then the servers fetch a curated list of categorized spaces that the client can display for the actors. Once an actor or player has joined a networked space, how do we support interactions within that space? From an interaction perspective, players have a limited but versatile toolset for communication, like snapping, and multi-hand grabbing, which facilitates sweet interactions like this one. Behind the scenes, we decided to use a hosted real-time networking solution, Photon. A lot of you have probably heard of it. And it lets us synchronize a small amount of shared state per space and per player, like the positions and rotations of each of a player's body parts. We also use remote procedure calls sometimes for short-lived one-off events that don't really need to be strictly synchronized when a new player joins the existing space. So for example, if a player snaps, that's a very short-term event, and we don't need that to be synchronized when a new player comes in. We don't care that the snap happened in the past. Our custom servers are reserved for more higher-level decision-making, so matching players into shared spaces, and also monitoring, because we really want to know if we need more live actors on staff, or if we currently have too many live actors for the amount of players who are currently playing. It also provides a persistence layer so that we can store information about players' past interactions with live performers, and we can use that to match them into spaces where we think that they'll have the best experience. Finally, what tools does a live performer have to create magical moments that make players feel special? Actors in the underpresents can actually speak with players, and players can't. And actors can use their standard improv talents to great effect. But they also have very powerful abilities that are unique to the underpresents. They can shape the virtual environment, for example, by conjuring objects out of nothing, or even completely changing the layout of the virtual stage. These are mostly one-off abilities, and there are a lot of them. So one of our big challenges has been in creating an interface that could support this flexibility without getting in the way of the actors actually acting. In some of the early prototypes we had, actors would be super engrossed in the interfaces and staring at their hands, and that really detracted from the experience of their acting. In our current iteration, we're using a radial menu system that allows an actor to select what kind of ability that they want to use, and then trigger it on a button press. And they don't have to look at their hands throughout any of this process, which creates a very fluid experience. However, this is an expert interface, and it requires training to use. The benefit is that it leads to seamless performances that are interwoven with unexpected, delightful moments. Actors need to be able to refer back to players based on what players have done in the past. In some of our early prototypes, our live performers had trouble referring to players because they do look very similar and they can teleport around, which can make things very confusing for actors. That's why we added these colorful labels above players' heads, and you might have noticed those in some of the earlier images. These are only visible to the live performers, and they may seem like a small addition, but it made a world of difference. Working with Piehole has been great because they've helped us figure out how to bring immersive performances to VR, and that's something that Tara will talk about now.
Hi, I'm Tara again, and I'm part of Piehole. I'm a theater director, and Piehole is a live arts collective with 5 members, and we make live theater and experimental theater that takes place in a lot of different formats and spaces and environments. So we started out actually as a puppetry, doing a lot of puppetry, and so you see that on the left. That's a show that had the audience sitting in one place and looking at a stage. And on the right, you see an installation. Those are audience members in an installation. So we play around with a lot of different formats, sometimes with the audience seated, sometimes with them roaming, and sometimes with the performance basically taking place among the audience. But in all of the different cases of our work, we're trying to foster agency among the audience and kind of rewarding a curious viewer. So just a little bit about the puppetry. That is sort of like one side of our background as a company. We do a lot of what's known as physical theater, which it has a strong visual component to it, puppetry, mask work, and basically work that's very physical and an awareness of the body and creating kind of efficient storytelling through the body, which has proven to be very relevant for performing in an animated VR setting. We also have done a lot of ensemble-driven created work in theater. And so what that means is that our members are not just performers, they're generative performers. So they're also writers, and they have experience improvising, and they also have experience kind of developing characters and the writing for characters in a larger narrative context, which is also something we've drawn on in the process of working on in VR. And that kind of work is often referred to as devised theater. So devised theater and physical theater are both backgrounds that have proven to be very helpful for this process. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just developing content for live encounters, kind of picking up from where Samantha had left off. And I'm mostly talking here not about the soundboards that she spent a little bit more time with, but the unscripted, and I'll put that in quotes, because a lot of the encounters that we've been developing, they have a set structure, or like a checklist that the actor needs to accomplish, so it has an arc to it, but they're improvising around that structure. And so to create these moments, first of all, Samantha has provided a kind of Bible for the Under that has the Under mythology or backstory in it, so that any performer coming into this process can actually know what the world is that they're creating in, and it kind of gives them what they need to know to be able to actually improvise. Because if they don't know that backstory and don't have a fluidity with it, then they kind of don't have any guidelines to develop a character. And then when we actually coming up with these live encounters, the first thing that we really need to ask ourselves is what makes something feel live? And throughout the process, we keep questioning this. We may have some guesses about this seems like it might feel live, and then you actually try it out, and you realize that it's really obvious that the player doesn't realize it's live. So that's been something that we've had to continue to troubleshoot throughout the process. But one starting point that we found to be very helpful was to ask the question, can this happen without a live actor? And if the answer is yes, then it probably isn't taking advantage of the liveness of the actor. So that's been a really useful starting point of this can only happen if you have a live actor doing it. And then once we go from there and we start to develop the actual ideas, then we identify those key structural points that I was mentioning that will allow the actor to riff off of while knowing what they need to accomplish. And then each actor can develop their own voice and their own characterization so that different characters can inhabit different live encounters or live stage acts. So some of the challenges that we found working in VR that are different from theater mostly, one of them is just the experience of being in this kind of awe-inspiring animated VR setting can be pretty overwhelming. So both for the performer who may not have much experience in VR, going in there, just being in there can be such an overwhelming experience that it takes them a little time to find their footing, to be able to have that kind of fluidity and flexibility to do all the things they need to do in there. And it also can be overwhelming in a way for a player going in there who just sees this space that's expansive and they just, want to go and see, like, this is a view from the stage. And so the audiences kind of would be where those stars and the star and square are on the floor. And then there's those stairs and the archway in the back that kind of invites you to go see what's out there. So there's a lot to kind of compete with for the performer in kind of addressing the audience. And another challenge, if you're coming from theater, is just the audience behaves differently than they would in a VR experience than they would in a theater experience. So here we see the audience throwing onions at the stage, and a theater audience is just typically more reverent to the performers. And that's, there's a lot of different kinds of theater, things that can be called theater, and some that where people are a lot more respectful, and maybe some where they're more talkative. There's a whole range. But just generally speaking, in VR, or I think probably because of the gaming tendencies and all of that, it's not like you're just being a jerk by throwing things. That's actually a way to test the limits of the space. It's like a legitimate way to encounter this space, especially if you're being told that there's live elements. You want to test that. So just understanding that the players coming in are not necessarily coming in there just to see you, the actor, do their thing. They have so they're testing the limits, and it's a different way of kind of commanding the space. So one of the things we can draw from some theater techniques to think about how to command the space as a performer, and that includes physical and vocal techniques. Like I was saying, the physical theater background is helpful for that, and just things like using your body in specific ways to kind of create suspense or command control through contrasting rhythm. And same thing with the voice, using different volume and different rhythm to kind of pregnant pauses, etc., to kind of draw people's attention in and break up the rhythms that you're playing around with. And those actually have been very helpful, especially for the live stage acts. And then for the one-on-one encounters, also thinking about the use of just volume to create a more intimate experience and draw people in, versus when you're doing a live stage act and you want to reach the person who's running away or whatever. And then we can also turn to theater live performance formats like drag, cabaret, burlesque, and comedians, live comedy, and how they do crowd work and handle an audience. So this is Taylor Mack, who's like a superstar drag performer, and his advice is he talks about how, in a drag show, you never know who you're going to be encountering. You might have an audience member who just goes really rogue or is antagonistic or something. And so he always says, if that person is being a rogue, if you just sit there and try to ignore that, then they're going to win. Their spotlight's always going to be brighter than yours. But if you try to kind of combat it and, kind of take on that antagonistic relationship with them, again, their spotlight's going to be brighter than yours and they're going to win. So what he says to do, and I'm totally paraphrasing, but it's like you go and you stand inside of their spotlight and you kind of scoop them into what you're doing and you make them part of your act, and then you win. And that's actually a principle that the performers have really been drawing from when they're doing that. Especially the live stage act, but actually in the live one-on-one encounters too, you're trying to have this intimate moment, and this particular player just wants to swoop around and not paying attention to you. So you have to know you can't just keep insisting that they do. You kind of have to navigate that a little more artfully. And then on top of those theater techniques, we've been working with Tender Claws to kind of establish a power dynamic that helps the actor command more control, considering all those challenges I was mentioning. So the technical interface and the kind of superpowers that the performers have, like the ability to teleport a player or make objects appear, all of those things. And the fact that the live actors have the ability to speak and the players don't, also helps them kind of have a little bit of an edge on the players in terms of commanding space. And another key element here, I mean, I'm talking about these improvised encounters. And so I think a lot of people, when they hear about improvisation, they're like, oh, you don't need to rehearse, right? But there's many reasons why actually improvising these acts requires even more rehearsal, because you need to not only be comfortable with the interface, as Julian was describing, but you also need to be able to have such a fluidity with the structure and with the world and mythology of the under and this character that you're developing, that you can change course at any moment. If you don't have that rehearsal time, then you'll just be trying to fit your script, and you won't be able to have the fluidity to be responsive to all the changes happening around you. It's different every time. And then the other key thing that we have discovered through this process is creating a balance between, what I've been talking about so far are ways for the actor to kind of have control and command and draw attention. But then the other side of that coin is to also let go and to allow so you want to be able to acknowledge the players and make them feel seen and respond to what they're doing. But you also don't want to insist that they pay attention to you the whole time. So, because like we've all been saying, like just discovery and exploring the space are all really legitimate ways of inhabiting this experience. So, you know, we want to be able to allow people to explore and run away from you if that's what they want to do. But still acknowledging it so that it's clear that we see you and I'm a live person who sees what you're doing. And then there's other fun ways of kind of teaching the players how to behave, and that kind of allow you to be either reverent or subversive. So, for example, the live stage hosts are able to place the players in a cage. And so that's kind of like a punishment, like for being bad. You know, if you throw something at the stage, the live stage act the host can say, if you do that again, I'm going to put you in the cage. And of course, then the player will most likely do it again. And then they go in the cage. So it's like a punishment, but it's also kind of a reward because you get to see this other view of the space. And so it's just ways of kind of, and that's a really good example, I think, of putting the spotlight on the person and scooping them in. So you're punishing them, but it's just another layer of the experience. And then, so at Sundance, we did what in theater we refer to as previews, which is just the first time you encounter an audience. And so this gave us a chance to really explore different types of audience behavior. So one of the things that we notice is that sometimes, yes, you have these people who just want to throw things the whole time. And sometimes the host would react to that by also throwing things, and now we're throwing things. That's what we do now. But then you also would have these audiences who are really interested in just hugging everyone, and so that's why I have this huggers versus throwers. And so it's just all these different ways that the players have found to interact with each other. And sometimes you have a group that's actually shy, and if you don't have one player in there that's more outgoing to kind of teach the other players how to be outgoing, then you might need the live actor to help encourage those kinds of interactions. And then again, another thing we discovered was the tendency for sometimes you would notice that a player is trying to say something verbally, and that's not a power they have. So then the actors would adjust what they were saying in the subsequent performances so that it would take more advantage of the verbal tools that the players actually do have, like snapping, or they can nod or pick things up and hand things to each other, and not ask questions or give them prompts that would make them think they're supposed to give you some kind of essay in response or monologue or whatever. And then, and once again, and I think I've already mentioned this, but doing the previews also really gave us a full experience of when you know, you think you have this 7-minute live act that has all these points, but because of the other circumstances of what the players have experienced and what they haven't experienced, you might just have to cut it short halfway through and completely change course and say, okay, well, that's it for this show. And then you whisk off, turn into another character so that you can then be there to have a live encounter with some other player. So just having that kind of versatility and flexibility becomes really key in this setting. So then now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya, who's going to talk about production and the logistics of everything, making all this happen.
Thank you. I'm Tanya Leal Soto. I'm the producer for Tender Claws. And logistically, how does it happen? I'm briefly going to talk about organizing multidisciplinary teams, developing workflows for acting virtual spaces, the glorious human factor, and I'm going to close with why is this not a location-based experience? So organizing multidisciplinary teams. One fun thing that we haven't mentioned here is that Tender Claws is based in Los Angeles, while Piehole is based in New York City. So this on itself made it interesting. We had to be really careful when coordinating all the communications, but also not only the communication, but the way to translate the terms, you know, the terms that developers use versus the terms that the actors were using, or even like things that Samantha would be creating. And we had to agree in naming conventions because our teams are not cut with the same scissors. So within Tender Claws, we all have different backgrounds. We come from fine arts, from film, from programming, from puppeteering, theater, and we all wear many hats. All the hats sometimes. This is not a hat. The combination of all these disciplines and the collaboration with Piehole helped everybody in these teams broaden their perspectives. We were able to get different vantage points on different situations, and it was very beneficial to have somebody attack the same problem from a different angle. Our first organizational stone that you already heard about was the Bible that Samantha created, and thanks to that, we were able to allow for different departments to continue to add to this world. A good example of this was understanding the layout of the stage and how these would affect the live actors' interactions with the players. So, for example, our art director, Carter, looked for a bunch of reference on stages, and then Jeff from Piehole would draw this elaborated sketch informing us of the actual layout of the theater. And we had these discussions on ideas of how these spaces could be useful, how could we use them to create moments with the live hosts and moments with the actors doing the one-on-one encounters. And then our creative director, Danny, would start working, you know, with the team on potential interactions until we finally had our glorious stage. All these crowdsourced information also helped make decisions to allow both the player and the live actors to have some agency. For example, a decision was made to not allow the players on stage unless the live host invites them. And this way the live host can still control their space and have the ability to use this power to make the player feel special. So then, developing workflows. This has been an ongoing process and will help us when we actually scale this project, because we're gonna have to train actors. And the reality is we've realized that we need to train them in VR, in the virtual world. Thankfully, the untethered nature of the headsets that we've been developing in has allowed us to actually rehearse in the headset, in the virtual world, where different people can log in. Some of the actors will be training. Tara will also be there giving notes. Samantha will be there giving notes. It's been a very interesting experience. But because of what we soon had to consider, the human factor, we started having a lot of interesting findings. One which Tara already mentioned, which is like when the actors come into this world, settling into the VR space and into the character's physicality is something that varies from person to person. Embodying characters means puppeteering different sized bodies, and the movements sometimes have to be like really exaggerated, and you can only understand how to move your character in the space in VR. For example, one of our characters, the cook, oops, sorry. Let me play the space bar. There you go. The cook is a very large character, and everybody who embodies it, you know, they have to like do like this very, very large gestures, which we realize it becomes really, really physical. So some of the learnings from our previews, which Tara talked briefly about, essentially, again, we had to consider the human factor. One interesting thing was how do we do actor shifts? How long are these people going to be acting? And we looked to SAG, to the Screen Actor Guild, and Equity, which is the theater union, but neither really reflected the work that these actors were doing. SAG actors can be on set for 12 hours, but at the same time, they have a lot of breaks every time that they're setting the camera, changing scenes. These actors are resting. And in Equity, they're meant to have 10-minute breaks every hour and 20 minutes. But all of this really doesn't mean anything for the way our actors were working.
Hello and welcome to Thunder Down at the Under. My name is Jimmy String Bean Salami, Ohio, and I'm here to show you a good time. If you know how to play by the rules, I know how to give a show to you.
Sorry. Even during our rehearsals, one of the findings was understanding the physical and the mental demand for these actors. The live hosts have to be engaging, loud. They have to be trying to attract the attention of the players and at the same time interact with the rest of the audience. Actors doing one-on-ones or possessing NPCs have to be in constant state of alert and in character while they're in this virtual world waiting for the opportunity to start a new adventure with somebody. But the reality is you start losing track of the time when you're in the space, and the passage of time is really different. So we settle, when we're doing the previews, on 2-hour shifts for actors. It would be like 30 minutes log in, a 5-minute break, 30 minutes log in, a larger 10-minute break at the hour, and then again another hour. And then we change actors. And this seemed to work really good. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is why would we choose to do this non-location based. If you know our work, Tender Claws creates long-form narrative projects, and we're always looking for ways to encourage exploration and create the desire to come back and find out more about the world and the narrative. In the Under Presents, we want to create a space where people want to come back to be able to scale the experience. We will have a loop of pre-recorded acts so that when players come into the world, there's always something exciting happening. The Honor will run without dependency of the live host on stage. However, the part of the magic will be to find yourself interacting with a live host or being swept away by an actor for a more intimate moment. But you won't really know when that is going to happen. Finally, our takeaways. The way we've been trying to bring live actors into these spaces: create modular scripts, optimize responsiveness, designing narrative to maximize live actor resources, build infrastructure to support objectives, make players feel seen, then set them free, and consider the human factor when training actors to perform in virtual spaces. So that's all for today. We're going to open it up for questions. If anybody wants to ask us anything. Thank you very much.
That's how I ask a question. I think it's really interesting when you talk about trying to encourage players to understand that they're dealing with a real actor. And from a game design and narrative design perspective, can you guys elaborate on that at all? As far as like, what tools are you giving, or how are you directing the player in ways that give them utility to discover that they're dealing with a live actor?
Part of that is actually in the difficulty of something that's more AI and more of an NPC to be exactly responsive in particular ways that you know is not possible by the presence and the movement, and like that kind of the change of the discovery of how that happens. And there's actually not all of the one-on-one encounters are already pre-recorded voice. A lot of them are live voice. So that actually, can contribute significantly. And being able to call very one-to-one onto what the player has done and make references to things they've already done previously is one of the ways we're doing it.
Right, like, so if a player picked up an object and then dropped it and then picked it up again, then to like really, you who dropped the martini glass and can't keep it in your hand, maybe you've had too many already. Like just finding ways to be really specific to that player and what they've done helps them. There's no way that like it's programmed, like there's no way that that player's actions have been done consistently enough for that to have been pre-programmed or something.
This is probably a question that would be answered by actually playing the game, but I'm just trying to get clarity on the balance between the soundboard and the live dialogue. Mm-hmm. If people have the soundboard, and the reason for that was to have a consistency of voice with the pre-recorded, what do you do with the voice when it's live? And how do you balance that? Can you help?
Yeah, I'd say like 80% of all the live encounters are not soundboards. It's a very specific case for like very specific NPCs that the player already has relationships with in the game. So when you get to the soundboard, it's a thing where it may not, you may not realize that it can be played by different actors.
So specific characters have soundboards,
yes.
and other characters are created by each actor in
yes.
the moment. Okay, got it. Cool. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, so you mentioned that players can talk. I was wondering if that was a decision from the get-go, or if you had experimented with letting the players talk.
Yeah, I think we can all talk to this. That was a decision from the get-go for many reasons. One of it is we were inspired by Journey in our decision to, like kind of responsiveness of like the emergent types of play and gesture and behavior that comes from that. And we're also, we wanted to give like power to the actors as well. But yes.
Yeah, it allows the actor to guide the experience a little more fully, because as soon as the players are able to speak, then it's like a whole other narrative emerges, and they bring in their own real life history. And there's so many narrative components to this experience, and it's such a unique world with its own rules that having the players bring in a whole personal history can really, it makes it a lot harder to guide them through this narrative
And
experience.
also from a strictly technical perspective, it's a lot easier to have bandwidth for a single person talking at a time than every player on stage at the same time. You all know how bad Skype calls are. Try imagining that in VR.
One other thing too, like I think a lot of people, at least in the theater world, like when you think about interactive stuff or where you're being put on the spot, I think a lot of us feel like, oh, don't make me talk. So I think what we found in the preview period with this was like a lot of people actually found it really freeing to not have to say things and to be able to like, it kind of opened them up to take more risks and to participate more, because then they didn't have to like worry about saying something clever or something like that. So, and I know that that's a taste thing, but I personally found that freeing.
The same basic question. So just as a quick follow-up, then, do you see yourselves ever exploring that space where players are speaker, or do you think it's just like the challenges are too high and it's not really something you would
I think that something that Danny, who's our creative director, also mentions too is the decision for the players to not be able to speak is also coming from giving them different ways to explore the world. And that is something that we are actively trying to do. So, like they have these things like the snapping or holding hands. And it's really like a way to create ways for them to explore.
I think there's plenty. I mean, we're not, we're trying to do a very different thing than alt space in terms of artistic intention. So, yeah. Thanks.
Well, so fantastic. And I love not being able to speak and sleep no more. I mean, I think that's such a wonderful part of that experience. So don't let the players read. I don't think. My question is, I guess mostly for Tara, but maybe for everybody in particular. Like, how did you approach movement for the performers? In terms of just their performance and like veering on dance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really felt, for me, connected to our work in puppetry and mask, but thinking about efficiency of gesture, big enough gestures that can read, and things can get really muddy. I think what we found when we were doing motion capture for the pre-recorded stuff, it's amazing how many little gestures the setup picks up. And so we realized that we just kind of had to pare things down in a way, because if it got too muddy, or if the gestures weren't efficient enough, it would start to get muddy and blurry, and it would be harder to it wasn't as legible, basically. And then with the live encounter interface, it's a little bit different than the motion capture because you don't have like sensors on the body. So, so that, and then there's also the like interface you have to interact with and all of that. But it's a lot more in the upper body and a lot less in the lower body, I'll say.
Part of one of the aspects of the scalability is we're using quests that are dispersed over like hubs in various places. So it's not like motion capture, it's using just the quests for the movement.
Yeah, so that's why we don't really have their legs in the picture so much. I mean, they can walk.
Yeah. There's creative decisions we make around that. So.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
This is also a question more for Tara. Being so involved purely with live performance, how did you find Tender Claws, and how did you realize that your future was with this VR tech?
Like how did I meet Tender Claws, you mean?
Sure.
Well, we've known each other for a long time, and we've actually been working in parallel with one another for over a decade. And so we've actually always had a shared sensibility, and we're both very interdisciplinary companies with members with all different backgrounds. It's just that we're often bringing people from different disciplines into theater, and they're doing this more in interactive media of different types. So it's kind of funny that this is our first like full-on collaboration. But it was exciting for us to kind of do what we were always doing with other artists, bringing them into our home, and to like actually bring our stuff to another discipline.
And we pitched and created this project explicitly to work with them. So.
Thank you.
3 more minutes.
How do you plan on maintaining a project like this? Like, obviously you have to have live actors in there, and then supporting players from different time zones across the world possibly, and then like the longevity of it. Like, how do you plan on tackling that?
Yeah, there's that's actually a complicated question with a lot of different stages. I think we can all speak a little to it.
We're going to treat these like runs of theater. We're going to have essentially at the beginning like a 4-month live service, and we'll see how that turns out. As we were saying, the whole game is meant to can run on its own without the live actors. But depending on how things start playing out, we'll have like different runs or not. If it gets super popular, then we can pay a lot of more actors. But we are, considering for both things, like the live service and what happens when that's not there.
I think Tanya already mentioned this, but the idea right now is not to have live actors available 24/7. So as a player, you would go in not knowing whether you'll get a live actor or not, a live encounter or not. So that's part of the experience.
I think right now we're testing on North American time zones, so probably from 10 a.m. to like X amount, like 9 a.m. And we can use data from VVR to kind of, work with like scheduling, but we do want, there will be more than one actor at the same time.
Yeah, and some of our monitoring interfaces are built so that we can see what usage is at specific times, and that will help us adjust as time goes on.
Cool. Thanks.
I'm sorry, we have very little time left, so this is going to be the last question. We can meet up in the wrap-up room in room 204 after the talk.
I just had a question about the sort of direct improvisational acting versus the sound box stuff. Is at one point you had an actor directly speaking, and other times they're choosing what to say. Is there a balance between those? How do you balance that? And there must be a lot that's lost in the sound box versus direct dialogue, if that is happening at all.
Yeah, so direct dialogue is 80%, and it's mostly other characters. The soundboards are very specific NPCs that, because there's about 4-hour content of just a single player game and multiplayer experience that you don't see, that's not involved, that the actors come in and out of. So there's particular NPCs that you meet and you get to know over time, and because their identity is established, that's one of the reasons that we kind of have this, like a soundboard, but it's not, it's really the delicate and the graceful way of writing that soundboard that doesn't make it feel canned, which is important.
So it's a separate category of actor that will be sort of hired to operate the soundboard, or it's just a different role that you're playing at that moment?
It's a different role. People will be, we've trained people on different methods, yeah.
And your intention is that as you scale up, you'll hire more and more actors to fill those direct dialogue speaking roles, I would assume, or?
Yeah.
Yes, right now we plan to have a couple of hubs where we'll have actors there working, doing shifts. Because we're using the Quest, we can just give headsets to some actors, like for example, Piehole, and have them log in from their homes. Julian is working on a system where we can start identifying the times where there's more people. We can send alerts being like, oh my God, there's a lot of players right now. We need like people in, and the actors who have been given headsets can just log in.
And it's important to mention that we actually have an elaborate behind-the-scenes system of prioritizing people who have not yet seen a live actor in different ways, so that they're, sorted in specific ways. So.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. I think that's all our time. Thank you so much.